Okay, so I want to go back to the devices and repeat a little bit some of my introductory statements about the devices. The extensional devices, which facilitate the extensional orientation, and the safety devices, which combat elementalism. Somewhere in the literature on Adorno, maybe it was in the secondary work on Adorno, or maybe it was in a review of a secondary work on Adorno, I came across the following notion, and that is that, of course, this person wasn't attempting anything like a summary of the burden of Adorno's message, but it seemed to him that an important aspect or theme in Adorno's work, it was almost as if he said Adorno wanted to give us an asterisk that we could put beside every concept in order to remind us that there is no concept, or that the object does not go into its concept without the remainder, or something like that famous quote. Can anyone be more precise than I just was on that quote? I asked that last week too. So with these devices of general semantics I suggested last week, we actually have 6 different kinds of asterisk. Pointing to, literally like the index, pointing to 6 different ways in which the concept fails to subsume its object, or the object. And I think I said last week that I suspect strongly that Adorno would have hated general semantics, but he might have liked this part. Might have had a good word to say about this part. Adorno probably would have hated general semantics because it was too easy to understand, among other reasons. I don't know if it's all that easy to understand. Like 20 years of trying to teach it, sometimes I wonder. But, that's in my lower moods that I have that thought. So there's the index, which points to the uniqueness or specificity of the object. Let's work with the example I was using last week, fascism. Okay? So fascism 1 is not fascism 2. The index allows us to point to any specific fascism that we choose to mark out conceptually and distinguish it from the others, while of course maintaining the possibility of generalizing about fascism, because the concept is not abolished, it's still there. Fascism is still there. So we can still think about fascism. But our thinking and theorizing about fascism is going to be enriched, complicated, and enriched by an optimal kind of devotion to the particularities of different forms of fascism. I told you about a book called Fascism in Ferrara, in which the author, I think his name was Paul Connor, complained about how difficult it was to compare fascism in Ferrara, fascism in Milan, fascism in the south, fascism in the north, etc., etc., etc. And then there's the date. Fascism 1926 is very different from fascism 1936, which is really incredibly different from fascism 1946, where Mussolini was already hanging upside down with a bull-driven body. Of course, what you see here is that although we can point to a specific time of fascism, a specific historical period, even a day, even 15 minutes, even 1 minute in the history of fascism, we also don't abolish the continuity of fascism over time. And the date can point not only to a specific time, but also to the way in which each specific time incorporates or contains within itself its historical predecessors along that time. So fascism 46 is very different from fascism 26, and yet simultaneously contains it. And then the chain index, which I abbreviate this way. Well, fascism 1926 in the context of where my exampling fails me, let's say maybe in the context of the fascism of workers, and there was a fascism of workers in Italy, it is not the same as fascism 1926 in the context of business. That's not a good example. I don't feel it's a very good example. And that's about as far as we got. We talked about the index and the date, and in detail, and that's as far as we got. And I also assigned tasks having to do with the index and the date, and I gave out a handout which was supposed to help you to do the task. Of course, it's probably hindering you as much as it's helping you. And if anyone wants a copy of that, you can ask me when you leave. And I'll be assigning similar tasks today in relation to the next devices. I also suggested last week that we could say that the devices reform the language, that they make it less Aristotelian and more non-Aristotelian, less Aristotelian and more non-Aristotelian, so that the structure of the language becomes more similar to the structure of what is going on, similarity in structure, because in the structure of what is going on, the label is not the object, is not the event, or the event is not the object, is not the label. And here with the use of these devices, also always, of course, with the help of the structural differential in the back of our minds, the language itself now is revised so that the object is not the label, is not the event, or at least is moving in that direction. So that the devices inhibit the tendency to identify. Devices work against identity. Or we could say they inhibit the tendency to evaluate unsanely. Or to put it positively, they facilitate the tendency to evaluate more sanely. And another way I put it was that the only few words that have survived in general semantics, the map is not the territory. In the general culture. The map is not the territory, is brought directly into the mapping. The caution, it's a caution, the map is not, the territory is brought directly into the map, directly into the mapping with these devices. Okay, so any question up to that point about the general statements I made or about the date and the index that we talked about last week specifically, and since there aren't any like a good option here, I'll go on to the higher priced commodity. What did we just say? I gave a lot of examples of use and non-use of the index and of the date. Not as many as I have here. I have many more examples here than I gave. I'll just mention one here. Canadians are more attached to their provinces than to Canada as a whole. There's a non-use of the index. It's as if Canadians, it's as if every Canadian is covered with that. So you would correct that by pointing out that Canadian 1 is not the same as Canadian 2. And that could go up and down. I mean, individual Canadian 1 is not the same as individual Canadian 2, and Ontarian is not the same as Quebecer. Easterner is not the same as Westerner, and so on with regard to this generalization. So now we get to the etc. Of course, I've already talked about it, so it's not as if it will be completely new to you. So let's pick on Korzybski's favorite person. Who's Korzybski's favorite person? Smith. It always reminds me of Winston Smith, 1984, which is appropriate because this is the Ministry of Truth, so a very non-rational association. So let's talk about Smith. Just one particular Smith. Not Winston Smith. Gary Smith. Now. Okay, so Winston Smith now. We've got the index and the date there. No matter how many identities and predicates we ascribe to her, for example, we may say, he is a Rastafari. No matter how many identities, such as Rastafari, we ascribe to her, and for them, no matter how many classifications or categories can be applied to her, and no matter how thorough and detailed or thick the descriptions of her may be, or her descriptions of herself, there could always be more. There could always be more, and there should often be more. There should often be more. In other words, the story of Smith, the stories of Smith, the narrative of Smith, which is what makes Smith Smith, apart from the proper name, which is somehow independent of the narrative. Something we may have occasion to come back to later, is interminable. The story is interminable. And it's not only analysis that is interminable. Any story or set of stories is interminable. There's no end to it. And even if there could be an end to the story, the place where God writes, the journalists will put that at the end of the
They do still do that.
They still do that. Even if there could be a 30, which is where the story ends, there's nothing more to be said. Even if there could be such a place where there is nothing more to be said, well, there we would find Smith at the object level, purely speaking. That is, the living, breathing, vulnerable human. Smith, there's the proper name. Just Smith. Beyond all stories, or prior to all stories. Containing all stories, but not reducible or identifiable with all stories. No set of categories could ever contain her. Whereas Shakespeare put it, age cannot wither, nor custom stale, or infinite variety. When I first talked about this, and of course this, my notes here, they're multi-layered, because as you may notice, I not only cut, but also keep adding to them. But that line has been in the course since the beginning, and I remember that because the first time I said that, Shannon was taking the course, and when I said that, age cannot wither, nor custom stale, or infinite variety, I looked at her and she sneered. A moment to remember. Shannon's my ex-girlfriend. So there's always more in and about Smith than could possibly be said or explained or described. So it's almost like we could use another kind of index here, a kind of ultimate etcetera, which would go like this. Smith, inconceivable. So as opposed to the ink of capitalism, in which everyone is eminently conceivable, that is marketable, we have the ink of inconceivable now. So he or she cannot be reduced to an instance of the category man or whatever. The etc. blows closure in totality. I said that before about at the top of the mid-level and the structural differential, it's open. So one way or another, closure is blown, it's exploded, or perhaps imploded. Many of you, when you did your looking at a person task, immediately identified the person by gender. All, let's say. Immediately identifying the person by gender. No, okay. Well, I wouldn't praise those who didn't, nor condemn those who did. I'm just pointing to that. I don't say there's anything wrong with that. What I'm saying is one should be aware of it. That's all. So there's the consciousness of abstraction. Smith one is never a woman nor a man. She's always a woman, etc. So if we want to be rigorous, which would be the same as carrying sanity to an insane extreme, and we would never use a word without following an etc. Or almost any word would be followed with an etc. Could be followed with an etc. Oh, I don't know. How many of you have heard of Scott Peck? Every time I come up with something interesting, a little voice inside my head says, yes, like you're losing time. Well, Scott Peck is a popular writer, not very popular in this room, of Christian self-help books. And one of his extremely well-sold, the most famous one called
The Road Less Traveled.
The Road Less Traveled. So one of his books is called People of the Lie, and in which he deals with the vexed question of criminal justice and the larger thing, sin in general. And in this book he argues that some people, and I quote, are rotten to the core.
How Calvinist.
Sorry?
How Calvinist.
Okay.
No Catholic would write that.
Oh, okay. Rotten to the core. Now you can't very well put etc. after thinking like that. And it's a non-use of etc. I mean, if someone is rotten to the core, they're just rotten to the core. I mean, right? The minute you put the etc. there, you haven't qualified the formulation rotten to the core, you've abolished it. So nothing could be more essentialist or elementalist in Korzybski's language than this notion of rotten to the core. Okay, he's saying some people are incorrigible. That's a little bit better. It's moving towards a kind of E prime formulation, in which instead of saying that someone is rotten to the core, we would say that, for example, Saddam Hussein, who was Hitler just the day before yesterday. Who is Hitler today?
Obama.
Obama?
Osama.
No. He's
We would say of the Hitler of the day that his behavior has given us no indication of any possibility of rehabilitation. It takes more words, but it's a less unseen form of the notion of incorrigibility. I mean, your mother knows that you are incorrigible. I've cut a lot of stuff on the etc. so that I can move on. I've got a long quotation here from Judith Butler, her book Gender Trouble. She's written other stuff after that, but I'm still reading Gender Trouble. I read it every Tuesday and Thursday for the rest of my life. Judith Butler, Gender Trouble. She notes that on page 143 of the Radical General 1990 edition, she notes the habitual practice of theorists of multiculturalism, pluralism, etc., of listing, and I quote, predicates of color, sexuality, ethnicity, class, and able-bodiedness. In other words, the kind of discoursing which you read or hear, class, gender, race, ability or disability, and notes that they invariably close with an etc. at the end of the list. Butler notes that when people talk about class, race, gender, they always say etc. in the list, even if it's longer than that. Very often, if not always, an etc. is at the end of the list. Now, Butler has never heard of general semantics, or nobody has, right? So when I quote somebody who is using the etc., they're obviously inadvertently, perhaps using it in a sense, in the same sense as Korzybski is, by accident. She goes on to say, this horizontal trajectory of adjectives, and these formulation, the horizontal trajectory of adjectives, class, race, gender, ability. The horizontal trajectory of adjectives are classifications, right? Categories. Strives to encompass a situated subject. The horizontal trajectory of adjective strives to encompass a situated subject, strives to contain the subject within a set of categories, but invariably fails to be complete. Invariably, I stress, fails to be complete. The failure, however, is instructive, she says. What political impetus is to be derived from the exasperated, etc., that so often occurs at the end of such lines? She raises a question. What are we to make politically of the fact that whenever we strive to contain the subject in a set of categories, a horizontal trajectory of adjectives, the attempt invariably fails and the list it culminates in an etc.? Well, Butler is recognizing what I've called the etc. at the object level, the second class of etc., the inconceivability, the etc. of inconceivability, we call it. She's saying that the subject is inconceivable. Now, inconceivable doesn't mean unimaginable. It doesn't mean impossible. It means literally inconceivable. That is, cannot be conceptualized. The subject cannot be reduced to or contained within a set of conceptualizations. That's the etc. But Butler can arrive at it in the course of a highly abstract theoretical work. Korzybski puts it in every sentence of the language starting from grade 3. At least potentially. Well, she's suggesting, Butler, that the politics of identity, also known as the politics of difference, what's the difference between the politics of identity and the politics of difference? There's no difference. She's suggesting that the politics of identity difference could be supplemented with an alterity politics. Now, I don't know if she uses the term there. It is a term that I've seen used, and I picked it up myself. Alterity politics, which is not about how different we are from one another because you're a Jew and I'm a Catholic and you're a good guy and I'm a bad guy and you're a banana and I'm an apple, etc., etc. Not that, not to highlight difference among identifiable categories, but to highlight alterity. That is, the inconceivable singularity of every human being who is other, alterity, other than whatever set of concepts is striving to totally describe or contain alterity politics. Actually, I remember now some other place where I saw the term before, just a second before, a guy named Jeff Nealon, maybe with Cornell, wrote a book called Alterity Politics. So the task here, I'll say the task, we can sum up on the etc. in one word. The task is to find 5 examples of the use or non-use of the etc. Now, I was warning you against triviality in doing the task last year, and was the person who was concerned about how they were going to recognize whether triviality was a problem or not, who was sitting over there. Is he here? That's you. All right. So I'm glad you're here today because we can say more about triviality in connection with the etc. Oh, it's really easy to get trivial with the etc. In fact, I think I already used the etc. last week when I was trying to explain triviality. Like if I say, well, the fruit store has apples, oranges, pears, grapes, kiwi, persimmons, grapes, grapefruit, etc. It's trivial, who cares? So what? How are we advancing sanity by listing every possible fruit? Okay, that's an example of the use of triviality in connection with the etc. And there's another great danger when you do this task. I say it's a great danger because for 20 years it keeps popping up in the tasks, no matter what I do, no matter how much I say, don't do it. you all, that is you and all your predecessors back there, who are now 40 years old, will have kept doing it. If you find this mark in a text, that mark, it isn't necessarily a use of the general semantics device of etc. It could just be innocently sitting there in the text. Now, if it's Butler, it is a use of the etc., whether she knows it or not. But in many cases, it's neither here nor there. So it's probably trivial, but even if it's not trivial, it might not be an example of the use of the etc., which we want to point to the interminate, well, okay, I won't repeat myself, but I'll say more about that. This mark is very common in conventional designs. But what we're concerned with is the presence or absence of non-allness in the text. Well, here's another way we could put it. Is anything possibly important in this context being left out? Now, in the list of fruit, I've no doubt left out all kinds of fruits. I could have mentioned, but who cares? It's not important. So the question about what's the opposite of trivial? The opposite of trivial is important. The question is, if the etc. is being used, then the importance of multiply, the importance of pointing out that there's always more to be said, or that even if you could say it all, you could not contain the object of it. Here's another, well, Smith is a student, football player, violinist, philanthropist, and so on. This is getting closer to non-trivial. Depending on how you're doing with it, I might not crucify it for triviality. Depends on the context. What I think of here is the obituary at the back page of the Globe and Mail. So when you die, someone writes a nice little story about you, and Horowitz. Horowitz dies. Horowitz, blabbermouth, leprechaun.
Dad, everyone knows leprechauns are extinct.
Precisely. So okay, the author of the obituary or the headline writer is trying to point out that the person who's died is more than just one thing. There's a whole bunch of things. The point is, it's more likely a non-use of the etc. because even if you got 5 or 6 categories up there, surely there's a lot more that could be said about the person. So it's not a crime, but it's an indication of the tendency to allness in discourse and in text. It's not a crime because discourse inevitably tends to non-allness.
Sorry, can I just clarify? Sure. It is an example of the etc. if this does include an etc. But if it doesn't, if it just says, cellist, painter, student.
But if it says among other things.
Yeah.
If it says among other things, there's the etc.
Okay, yeah.
But if it just said he was a cellist, a student, and a painter, period, that would be a non-use.
But that would be trivial.
It wouldn't be trivial, but it would be non-use.
Right.
In fact, it would be a non-trivial non-use. Right? Don't give me a list, a sort of unimportant list as an example of the use of the etc. Like the pet store sells dogs, cats, hamsters, ferrets, snakes, etc. Who cares? Here's a few other examples to help you along the way with the etc. What is written on the door of a Metro police car? To serve and protect. You've seen that so many times that you know it by heart. Every time you see a police car, you see to serve and protect. Now, there's nothing wrong with propaganda, and every outfit is entitled to its own propaganda, but we're entitled to the etc. You see? So I'm not saying erase that from the Metro police cars. I'm just suggesting, very, very humbly, if I may say so, to add the etc. to serve and protect, etc. In the full version here, I have a list of exemplifications. I'm not feeling so. My feelings about the police ebb and flow. And they come and go. What we want for Afghanistan. We used to say this about Iraq also, but now it's what we want for Afghanistan is democracy. Schools for little girls. Right? Schools for little girls is very important. We're in Afghanistan so that they can have schools for the little girls. And Canadian-style governance is important for the Afghanis. And there's no etc. in there. Is that all? You want it? Problem with Afghanistan. Did anyone mention oil? Oh, a good part of political discourse depends on the etc. Depends on leaving out stuff that raises questions about your side of the issue. And every time I hear the word Darfur, I reach for my etc. Because I've been told that in Darfur it was simply a matter of who is killing who there. The Tutsi is killing the Hutu, or was it vice versa? Rwanda. Did I say Darfur? I meant Rwanda. Yeah, Darfur is another one, but I know less about it because I've been told less. But I've heard a lot about Rwanda, and it was all about the who is killing who there.
Hutus killed Tutsis.
Hutus killed Tutsis. So, just out of the corner of my eye, I pay a little attention to whatever comes up about Rwanda, and I find out, hey, it ain't that simple, because actually they were all killing each other for quite a while before the genocide. But who knew that? That's an example of the non-use of the etc. Whenever you hear about a war crime or an atrocity or a massacre or a crime against humanity in political discourse, look for the non-use of the etc. Because every massacre, I would say every, but I would say probably a very, very, very large number of massacres and atrocities are actually revenge for previous massacres and atrocities that were done to the massacrer or atrociteer. So then we end up considering the very large problem of war rather than the much smaller problem of war crimes. I mentioned here before, maybe at our first class, that there's not just progress in history, there's also regress. Because when my father was your age, people were considering abolishing war. They were seriously considering. And now they're just excited about abolishing war crimes and punishing war criminals. As if it were possible to have a war without war crimes. I would like to see such a thing. Actually, I wouldn't. So, that's it for the etc. Any questions? Yeah.
Sure. I'm trying to remember, you in very first class you said something about like Hitler was, awful, but
He was a great
treated his
dancer.
dogs well.
He was a great dancer.
Not a great dancer. So if you see like Hitler is a, is a criminal, or Hitler is a whatever, whatever word you want to use to describe it, then you could say that's a non-use of the etc. Because he was also nice to dogs and a good dancer.
Sure. That was my very first example. I mean, it's almost too easy, but I don't know, maybe it's not so easy. For some people, it gives them a stomachache to think that Hitler was a human being. By the way, do you know why we say he was a great dancer? Again, in recent times. But these colorful little vignettes, Because at the fall of France, the Allied propaganda put out a little movie of Hitler dancing the jig when he heard the news of the fall of France. So that's why we say, hey, he was a great dancer. But then after that, it turned out that the Allied propagandists put that movie together out of cuttings from other films. And Hitler didn't dance at the fall of France, and in fact, we have no idea what kind of dancer he was. And if Eva Braun had survived, maybe she could have educated us about that. All right, so the next little thing here does not involve a task. It involves a kind of supplement to my discussion of the index. which I'm giving to you now because I didn't want it to interfere with your work on the index per se. This is kind of a complication within the field of the index. I call it the multi-ordinal index. Multi-ordinal. What is a multi-ordinal? Many levels, multi-ordinal, so many levels, or orders. Sometimes the levels of abstraction are called orders of abstraction. So the structural differential is multi-ordinal. It's multi-level. Multi-ordinal index, I will explain. The index can also be used to distinguish lower and higher levels of abstraction. For example, the term thinking can't think thinking without thinking Heidegger. And can't think thinking of Heidegger without thinking thanking. But that's just an aside for those who might appreciate it. So we have thinking, and here we have thinking about thinking. Thinking is, say, label level 10. Let's say thinking about thinking is label level. Okay, let's call it 11. So thinking about thinking. Thinking 1 is not the same as thinking 2. So this is multi-ordinal index. The ordinary index is lineal, okay? So physics 1 is not the same as physics 2, is not the same as physics 3, not the same as physics 4. They're all on a line. Or vegetable 1, I'll stay with physics. But then we have at a higher level metaphysics. Thinking about physics. So that's a multi-ordinal index. Why is this important? Well, Krzyzewski explains, maybe as early as grade 2, let's imagine that you have two apples sitting side by side. Have I shown you these apples before? Two apples sitting side by side. Why is he being so careful? You'll see it. That's the fruit, not the computer. Two apples sitting side by side. So if we ask, are these apples touching or are they not touching? Now, according to the Aristotelian laws of identity or logic or truth, either they are touching or they are not touching. Either what's his name at Fort Hood killed those people because he was crazy, or he killed those people because he was a jihadi. So these are two mutually exclusive truths. Either the apples are touching or they are not touching. Well, at the object level, we can see that they are not touching. And if we can stick a toothpick in between them, without touching either side, we can see that we can feel that they're not touching. However, at the event level, Krzyzewski tells us, at the event level, our science tells us that they are touching because the swirl of subatomic particles here, of which the apples consist, are overlapping. Which is why when you sit really close to someone you feel warm. You're literally overlapping, even if you're not actually touching. Well, there's an example of the multi-ordinality of truth. So what is true at one level is not true at another. So truth 1 at the event level is not the same as truth 2 at the object level. And this truth, which I am now formulating, is the words which I'm using in order to describe the situation as truth. So we have three different orders or classes of truth. And the more sane we are, the more we recognize their distinction. Of course, they're very closely related. The more sane we are, the more we recognize their distinction. And the more unsane we are, the more we insist on the truth. Are we touching or are we not touching? Are we telling the truth or are we a liar? What is love? Well, when your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever says to you that the reason they're so mad about you is that because they're in love with love. And love one is not the same as love two. And you got to ask them, well, is it me that you love or is it love that you love? Okay, so love one is not the same as love two. Of course, they could say both. I want to put down the love of love, and then there's the love of love of love. And I don't think we can go any higher, but you see multi-ordinality happening here. And our ordinary Aristotelian language doesn't want to be bothered with multi-ordinality. Or fear. I'll give you a quick psychotherapy for panic disorder. I may have mentioned this before, but I just forget. So here we have fear, and here we have fear of fear. At a higher level, you're on the way to panic disorder. If you have a fear of fear of fear, I don't know, you're going to need Xanax or something. That's why Roosevelt said we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And of course, he got it backwards. Because it is the fear of fear that escalates to panic. What about hate of hate? Love of love might intensify love. Fear of fear definitely intensifies fear. What does hate do to hate? Does it cancel hate out? Just a question. If we really hate hate, rather than hater, if we hate haters, then we're just at the same level. If it's like, I'm not going to get to this in class, but very often in political discourse, it's I am love and you are hate. So it's at the same level. I am love and you are hate. But what is so? And I hate you because I hate hate. But if we separate out the levels, and if we have hate of hate, then we could ask a question like, did Gandhi hate hate? Did the hate of hate cancel give us love? It's like in algebra, is it, do two minuses give us a plus? I told you about this in a New Age bookstore. I saw a gemstone, I think it was amethyst, which was labeled, this provides protection against superstition. Exciting times. Okay, now we're laughing. But what if it works? And indeed, how much of our, not only religious, but how much of our discourses are similar in structure to this one, and unless examined closely, we would just laugh at them, but actually, it's similar in structure to life itself, anyway, this kind of structure. Let S stand for superstition, so the superstition that combats the superstition is not the same as the superstition that combats. What about the Judeo-Christian Islamic idea of the one invisible God? Isn't that structured like the invisible God, which cancels out the visible ones? So you could say you don't believe in God because the idea of God is ridiculous. The point is that without the idea of God, you'd be worshiping sticks and stones and idols. It's the heart of monotheism. My father told me that he once asked his father, the chief rabbi of Western Canada, what is it with all this worship and praise of God? God needs our worship, he needs our praise, of course, if you ask a question as a Jew, you have to ask it in that tone of voice. And his father said, no, God doesn't need our worship or our praise. He just wants to protect us against praising and worshiping that which should not be praised or worshipped. So, worship invisibility, worship inconceivability, worship I am. Much of the continuous debate in Canada about the status of Quebec is rendered more unsane than it has to be by non-use of the multi-ordinal index. Former Newfoundland Premier Clyde Wells, for example, a man whom I admire greatly, arguing against special status for Quebec, said, and I quote, "The quality of my citizenship should not be inferior to that of Quebecers." I repeat, arguing against formalizing special status for Quebec, Wells says, "The quality of my citizenship should not be inferior to that of Quebecers." He seems to feel that a stronger provincial state in Quebec, that is a provincial government with powers greater than that of the other provinces, he seems to feel that a stronger provincial state in Quebec would give individual Quebecers an unfair advantage over other Canadians. And he's an intelligent, unsane, successful politician. Well, very popular, right? In his own province. Now, a large majority of people outside Quebec are in what is now called the rest of Canada, ROC, and it's not the Republic of Korea. It's Quebec and then the rest of Canada. If anyone ever asks you, whatever happens to English Canada? You can say, well, nowadays we call it the rest of Canada, because the notion of English Canada is politically incorrect. The notion of French Canada isn't, but the notion of English Canada is politically incorrect. But I digress from the digression. So a large majority of people outside of Quebec support the equality of provinces, and that's why they are with Wells against special status for Quebec. At least they were when I last paid any attention to this view. Today maybe they don't care anymore. Who cares? Some people say Quebec is not a province like the others, and therefore it should have special status. Well, it's true, it's not a province like the others, but that's not the multi-ordinal index. That's indexed on a line. Okay? Quebec is the homeland of a francophone nation. It's the only province that is also the homeland of a nation, and in that way it's unlike the other provinces, but all the other provinces also are distinct in their ways. You hear this a lot. Well, every province is distinct, right? So province 1 is not the same as province 2, is not the same as province 3. Every province is distinct, right? Got it? Okay, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about citizens of a provincial state at level 1 are not the same as the machinery of state, or the apparatus of state, or the symbol of state at level 2. And the inability to distinguish multi-ordinal levels, or in other words, to use the multi-ordinal index, is what makes that debate in Canada sound as if we are a nation of morons. I mean, that's my opinion. A nation of morons. The story of one nation. One county. So that's it for the multi-ordinal index. Systemic racism, I think when people use that term, they think what they mean is that it's a racism of individuals that is very widespread among individuals. Systemic racism is epidemic racism, something like that. But I think at least some people use that, the people who invented that term meant it to have a different connotation, and that is above the level of individual racisms, at a higher multi-ordinal level, there is the racism that is embedded in systems that just works automatically without any individual orientation, or much of it at all to speak of. So when you're talking about systemic racism, you're actually talking about a racism of which individuals may be completely unconscious. But the discourse so rapidly degenerates because of the absence of the multi-ordinal index. That when you try to explain this to people, you'll find yourself getting to the point where you're saying, oh, well, you are a racist, it's just that you haven't become aware of it yet, and I'm here to help you uncover your own unconscious racism. But that's not systemic racism, that's unconscious individual. See the difference? Just a final example of the multi-ordinal index, and I've got 10 pages of political examples here, but I'm going to move on. The chain index, says Krasitsky, brings the environment directly into the definition of the thing. It brings the environment in quotes. We haven't talked about quotes yet, but we're getting there. It brings the environment directly into the definition of the thing, and the thing is also in quotes. Why is the thing in quotes? Because it contains the environment. Or, that's not what I wanted to say. What I want to say is to repeat that. Because repetition will give you a kind of hypnotic trance state in which the meaning will be internalized. While your eyes are getting heavy. The environment is brought directly into the definition of the thing itself. We have no more thing in an environment, because the environment is brought directly into the definition of the thing itself. If you read Science and Sanity, you'll find Korzybski often using this formulation. Organism as a whole in an environment. Enough repetition. Here's an example, a simple example, rather than a complicated one. Let's take fish. Okay, it doesn't matter if it's salmon or tuna or herring or pickerel, that's trivial distinctions. You can't say I'm insane because I'm not specifying what kind of fish we're talking about. We're talking about any goddamn fish. Okay, so it's a triviality. Fish one. Fish one. Smith. A. Out of water is not the same as fish 1A. Fish 1B. Sorry. In water. That's an example of the chain index. You could say a fish is a fish is a fish. If you take the fish out of water, then the fish no longer contains the environment in which it can live. See, it's not just that the environment contains the fish. The fish contains the environment. So if the fish no longer contains the environment in which it can live, it is dead. And a dead fish is not the same as a live fish. So it's a very simple kind of ridiculous example. Here's another one. This is from Etcetera, volume 13, page 147. To a mouse, cheese is cheese. That's why mouse traps work. Okay, the mouse, although it doesn't have language, does have proto-concepts. That is, it has nonverbal evaluations. For example, the ability to distinguish food from non-food. So cheese is classified somehow at a proto-conceptual level by the mouse as food. But the problem is it doesn't have the chain index. In fact, how could we expect it to have the chain index? We hardly have the chain index. So to the mouse, cheese is cheese. That's why mouse traps work. Except, of course, you know, you may have noticed that some mice do learn to stay away from the traps. But generally speaking, to a mouse, cheese is cheese. That's why mouse traps work. So the same piece of cheese sitting on the floor is not the same as that very same piece of cheese in a mouse trap. Is not the same as that very same piece of cheese in a mouse trap. As we proliferate examples, this will become clearer. Here's a challenging example. The radio in your car car radio 1A. It's a car radio. It's this car radio, and it's in your car on the open highway. It's in your car on the open highway. That's CR1A. Is not the same as that very same car radio in your car going under a bridge. Because, you know, I don't know about car radios these days, but in my day, when the car goes under the bridge, the radio conks out or squeals. Kicks up a high-pitched squeal. Now, in our ordinary Aristotelian mode, we would prefer to think that there is a radio in itself, a self-existing radio, an inherently existing radio, which remains the same and just functions differently in different systems. But everything is functional. There is no such thing as a thing which functions. Right? It's like Nietzsche's dancer in the dance. There is no it apart from functions which has different functions in different contexts. There never was a radio in itself apart from any context which then enters into different contexts. The formulation, the radio in itself, is an Aristotelian way of pointing to the radio in the context where it is working right. That's a challenging example because it's really puzzling you. Don't worry, we're giving other examples. It seems what we call counterintuitive. That's why it's challenging. But the purpose of using a challenging example is to challenge you, right? To make the new way of thinking radically distinctive so that you don't just subsume it under your old way of thinking. Everybody knows that a car radio under a bridge, at least in the 1950s, would emit a high-pitched squeal. But what Korzybski is saying is it's not the same radio. It's a different radio, because the radio, we're going to define the radio now. We're going to redefine the car radio in such a way that it includes its environment within the definition of the car radio. So when Derrida says there is nothing outside the text, how many of you come across this infamous interpretation from Derrida? Rhetorical question. There is nothing outside the text. He says, he explained it himself. He says, well, what I mean by that is there is nothing outside the context. The context. There is nothing outside the context which then enters into the context. We define the thing itself in terms of its context. Adorno puts it even more radically. Adorno says, the thing itself is its context. And Korzybski says there is no simple fact. We're all trying to get across the same idea. There is no simple car radio, there is no simple fact, there is no simple fish, there is no simple piece of cheese. If you try and talk about a thing in a decontextualized manner, then unless it's a trivial decontextualization, which we can let you get away with, then that's a problem. Now, the chain index has a very important function also in the series of devices, because without it, we might have misinterpreted the index as revealing a singular thing in itself. Let's take Horowitz. Actually, let's take Smith. So, Smith. This Smith now. It seems like we've reached bedrock here. It seems like this Smith now is the real Smith. It's essentially Smith. It's the true Smith. It's the simple fact of Smith. The index, useful as it is, could mislead us into such a notion. But the chain index immediately saves it from us because Smith won, say, 2005 in the context of serving people food at McDonald's is not the same as Smith won 2005 taking his beloved dog Betsy for a walk, etc., 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 etc. For example. So, the index prevents singular individuals from disappearing into their identities. If we say Smith won, we protect him from disappearing into the identity of Smiths. Because it's Smith won, this is Smith. It protects Smith from becoming a mere instance of the universal category Smith, which was, by the way, the name of a trade, like blacksmith. But the chain index prevents each of these individuals from being taken as a simple, isolated fact, a simple individual, apart from whatever contexts he or she might find him or herself, for there is no simple individual. Now, in terms of the Buddhism that we were talking about before, the chain index, the chain index would be in the territory of emptiness. There is no inherently existing Smith. Smith is empty of inherent existence. But the index gives us the suchness of Smith. This Smith. Now, our mind boggles because we think we have to make a choice between indexing and chain indexing. But that's a measure of our insanity. Because without the chain index, there would be no index. Without the absence of inherent existence, there could be no actually existing suchness, like of a tree, for example, if you remember Potter's tree. But, I could have skipped the Buddhist stuff, because who has time for, in Yiddish it's called Buddhamaisis. Who has time for Buddhamaisis? Either you get the Yiddish or you don't. How many get the Yiddish? So a mice in Yiddish is like a story, a fairy tale, a fable. And in Yiddish, an old wives' tale is called a Bubba Maisa because Bubba is a grandmother. A Bubba Maisa. So I'm playing with that word here in a room full of non-Yiddish people. I'm talking about Buddha Maisas. Who has time for Buddha Maisas? Well, who has time? More examples. Solly Zuckerman was a British zoologist, an English zoologist. He went to Africa and studied gorillas. And he went and captured at least one gorilla. Yeah, he captured one gorilla and brought him or her to the London Zoo. And it was a big story at the time. Gorilla in London Zoo. Now, London Zoo, this must have been around the turn of the century. London Zoo is not like the zoos you know today. Young people where animals are so happy because they have these wide open spaces to roam around in which kind of replicate their natural environments. In those days, a zoo consisted of cages. Small, filthy cages. So Zuckerman found the gorilla, put him in a small, filthy cage. People came to gawk at him through the bars and throw stuff at him. He'd throw stuff back at them, and it's the gorilla story. And people would learn from this gorilla about gorilla nature. Right? But the chain index would have warned us. A gorilla in a cage in the London Zoo is not the same as a gorilla in the wild. That's the chain index. Oh, do you want to talk about human nature now? Let's talk about human nature now. Shudder, shudder. so far in most of our discourse, it can get more sophisticated. In most of our discourse, it's like, there is such a thing as human nature. There's no such thing as human nature. Yes, there is. No, there isn't. Yes, there is. No, there isn't. The right wing says, yes, there is. The left wing says, no, there isn't. Nature, nurture. Well, let's take human nature. Let's give it a 1. That doesn't make much sense here. Let's just use the chain index itself. Human nature A, in the context, say, of ancient Sumeria, is not the same as human nature B in the context of Tibet. Is not the same as human nature C in the context of Times Square. Now, chain index doesn't say there is no human nature. There it is. Human nature. But it says human nature differs according to the different contexts. Right? So we're going to talk later if we have time about genes and genetic determinism, biology versus culture, biologism versus culturalism. In a nutshell, the chain index has the answer. Of course, it's not an answer so much as a pointer, a kind of frame for investigation. There is no longer, with a chain index, an essential human nature, or a core human nature, or a basic human nature, which remains the same underneath its historical, contextual manifestations. There is no human nature per se, in other words, which would exist without any history and apart from any environment. If you took the DNA code and shot it to the moon, nothing would happen. You'd be dead. In other words, human nature is not DNA. There's a story which I told in Paul 320 when teaching Rousseau's The Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. I don't think, no, it couldn't have been Rousseau's story. But there is a story of a Renaissance prince, stop me if I've told it here before in some other context, who decided to raise a baby without language to verify that she would speak the natural language, or God's own language, which of course would be Hebrew. So the baby is raised without any context, without any linguistic context. How they manage that, I don't know. But they managed to raise a baby without any exposure to language.
Mostly, actually, I've read about the case by confining the child to a very few small rooms, and anyone found uttering any form of recognizable speech in the child's presence was immediately like
Off
sacked.
with their heads. Okay.
Pretty much, yeah.
All right, so you can imagine what the result was. The kid did not suddenly break out with Breshit bara Elohim, Horowitz. No. The kid was without speech and remained without speech and was impossible to teach speech because now our science, talking about structural differential, our science tells us that the human brain is such, hey, here's something about human nature across all contexts. The human brain is such that if it's not exposed to language at a particular critical period, then the relevant neurological structures in the brain atrophy, and therefore after that it's impossible to teach it a language. You've heard about l'enfant sauvage, the wild child? Okay, so they tried like hell, those French scientists, to teach it to speak. The child that had been raised by wolves, it was discovered at the age of 6 or 7 or something like that. It could barely squeak out a few expletives, and it could never learn to have sex either, if I remember correctly. It only had the mere rudiments of a sexual disposition. You might have thought that if there was anything natural and inherent in human nature, it's sexual desire, but it seems that without human company and language, that wouldn't be them either. So we're learning something here about the importance of context. While at the same time we can mark out certain things about human nature that are cross-cultural. Like the kid has to learn a language at a certain critical period, otherwise they won't be able to learn any language. What is universal is that I'll use the word programmed, we're programmed to learn a language. Without the programming, we wouldn't learn the language. But without the language, there would be nothing for the program to work with. So what is it, biology or culture? The particular language you learn depends on the context in which you learn language. And then there's accent. Like if you learn a language, if you learn a second language as I learned English, which is my second language, believe it or not. My first language was Hebrew, but I learned English when I was young enough so that I would not have a Hebrew accent. If I learned English when I was more than, say, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, then I would be stuck with an accent probably, or at least the traces of an accent for the rest of my life. So paradoxically, sometimes things that are learned in culture are harder to change than things that are received from nurture. Brain in a non-linguistic context is not the same as the very same brain in a linguistic context. And here it's really deep because the actual neurology of the brain will be different according to the difference in context. The car radio, in other words, here it's a matter of internal relations. The actual physical structure differs in different contexts. The car radio, you could take it apart under a bridge or on an open highway and you'd have the same pieces. So that's a matter of external. You could almost say there's two different kinds of chain index, but we don't have time to get into it. The one that is relevant to internal relations and one that's relevant to external relations. This is external relations, but I could take the cup away from the table, and although it's not the same as the cup on the table, it's similar enough. But if, when I took the cup off the table, its actual molecular structure changed, that would be like the heavier or more radical form of chain index, which involves internal relations. The brain of the wild child, or of the kid raised in the Renaissance print story, is not strictly speaking a human brain. A, the chain index can be applied to itself. So that chain index in context A is not the same as chain index in context B. I just did that. I just said a chain index in the context of external meaning is not the same as the chain index in the context of internal. If I set the thing on fire, the cup as such, the cup, I shouldn't say as such, the cup sitting here now is not the same as the cup on fire. That's internal. It's like fish in water and fish out. I just remembered the Buddhist injunction which in your meditation practice to pretend that your hair is on fire, to meditate with that degree of intensity, as if your hair were on fire. Well, just a little bit about personal characteristics. In the very first year of the course, when I was teaching the chain index, I had a student whom I remember to this day because he gave me some trouble. And he got into my notes. So he's immortalized. His name was Whitney, so I can't remember his last name. Whitney really objected to the chain index, especially to the application of the chain index to himself. Because you see, if you apply the chain index to yourself, the stability and identity of your personality starts wavering. I mean, you already know that you're not the same person with different people or in different contexts. But somehow you preserve the idea of some kind of essential core of personality that remains the same. I was in the habit for years of thinking that the Horowitz who's kind of pessimistic and in a bad mood is an essential Horowitz, and that the others are mere masks. Now I know they're all masks. There's nothing behind the mask. Of course, we don't have to go all the way there, but Whitney was trying to preserve his sense of humor. He was saying, there's something I know about myself which I'm sure would be true in all contexts. I've got this terrific sense of humor. Wherever I go, I tell jokes, people laugh. So he worked with that, in what I hope was a non-confrontational manner. What would happen to your sense of humor, Whitney, if people stopped laughing? Or, if you were in a cell in Guantanamo long enough. Now, the reason Mandela could preserve his sense of humor 50 years in a cell in South Africa is, if my information is correct, the jailing of Mandela was not all that rigorous. He still had a lot of human contact. Here's some other examples of chain index from an article written in as long ago as 1999, before 9/11, by a guy named Gerd Bauman, called The Multicultural Riddle. He writes, there are as many Islams as there are situations that sustain it. There's no such thing as an Islam outside of any context, which then takes on various masks or forms in different contexts. They're all masks. And I think it's in the same article that he writes, while all religions claim to have an immutable core, like for example, the example I gave last week was Christianity seem to have in common a belief in the special mission of Jesus Christ. I didn't say divinity or Son of God. All Christianities index seem to have in common a belief in the special mission of Jesus Christ, and all Islams seem to have in common the notion that Allah is Allah, Muhammad is his prophet, and absolute submission to the will of Allah, right? However, Bauman argues that even the meaning of that core changes as it is reasserted in new circumstances. So there is no immutable core. At the label level, there's a kind of static, unchanging formulation. The words Jesus Christ or Allah, they remain the same across the millennium. But the meanings ascribed to the words or verbal formulations will change as those formulations are reasserted in new circumstances. Now, my two favorite examples, and then I'll find a task. Or maybe I will. Maybe I will. This is from Eugene Gentleman. I mentioned him before. I recommended his book, Focusing. I recommend it again today. If this was a 2-year course, I'd spend like 2-3 weeks on focusing. I won't give you the reference if you want to give it to you later. A long article in the long title of an article in the book in a journal. For many years, LSD was given to research subjects. It's a little bit like the Renaissance Prince, as you'll see in a minute. For many years, LSD was given to research subjects in small, whitewashed hospital rooms. Do you know enough about LSD to already be shivering a little? For many years, LSD was given to research subjects in small, whitewashed hospital rooms. The experimenter observed through a peephole in the door. Every precaution was taken to avoid confounding the effect of the chemical itself with other factors. All right, now, LSD is a drug that is the effects of which are extremely context dependent, much more so than, for example, a cigarette. You could smoke a cigarette just about anywhere, although the strict chain index would say that a cigarette in the basement is not the same as a cigarette on the beach. Compared to LSD, it is. Because LSD in the basement is not at all the same as LSD on the beach. And these people were being studied in order to find out the truth about LSD by putting them not only in the basement, but in a small whitewashed room, where they could only freak out. I mean, you would have to have a very strong mind, whatever that means, not to freak out 8 hours in a small whitewashed room without any drug whatsoever. Without any drug whatsoever, you'd freak out. or 8 hours in a small whitewash room, okay? And these are Aristotelian scientists who want to separate cause and effect, find out the effect of the chemical LSD apart from any circumstances. But you see, try as they might, they couldn't remove it from circumstances. Because a small whitewashed room is as much a set of circumstances or a context as a beach surrounded by friends and lovely music and guavas and pineapple juice and hula hoops. That was my hula hoops. So there is no such thing as LSD in itself apart from any context. Okay.
If you were able to collect information on the experience of an LSD in every possible context, could then you just find the string of similarities that
Sure you
then makes it LSD?
Well,
That's not
but I
possible.
wouldn't say that makes it LSD.
Well, that makes it.
It's like the same as human nature, like a common characteristic.
Mhm.
Here, I'll give an example that's a little off the wall. I was wondering whether to give it or not. This is a good point. When I say, when we were told that to a mouse, cheese is cheese, and that's why mousetraps work, Alfred North Whitehead argues that the electron in a living body is not the same as the electron in a rock. Now, when I discussed this with my brother, the nuclear physicist, he got angry. He said, "God," he says, "an electron is an electron is an electron." Like that, 3 times. But according to Whitehead, the physicists abstract from the happening that we label the electron that which is common to all electrons in various contexts, and what is common, that which can be subsumed under the laws of physics. And the other stuff about the happenings we call electrons is abstracted out. So the electron, which the physicists are telling us is the kind of actual bedrock substratum of matter, is actually, according to Whitehead, an abstraction. The electron is an abstraction. But surely the physicists have many, many interesting things to say about electrons, which apply to electrons whether in a living body or in a rock. According to Whitehead, though, the electron in this body, an electron in my arm, as I raise my arm, is not the same as an electron in a rock. And if you want to learn more about Whitehead, you can't. It's too difficult. So I'll recommend a secondary work called Unraveling the World Knot. Unraveling the World Knot. There's an ambitious project. By David Ray Griffin. If you want to go to that book and look under the electron in the index, you can see this arguments. And if you're a good Deleuzian, you have to look into Whitehead these days, otherwise you'll be barred by your colleagues. Ostracized. So that is an indirect answer to you. Now here's another example. Also from Gentleman. The assistants in a research program on the capacities of infants. It's a recent study. This is not old Aristotelian science. This is state-of-the-art Aristotelian science. The assistants in a research program on the capacities of infants are instructed not to display emotional responses that could affect the infants. A student tells me that his superior, like the professor or something like that, or maybe the research assistant in charge of the project, stands behind him and firmly holds his head by the air so that it hurts whenever he unconsciously nods to the crying infant. Because they're trying to find out how the infant would behave in the absence of any response from human beings. So they're looking for that decontextualized infant nature. But other investigators study the capacities of infants that are responded to. I won't get any further. It's just amazing that people try to find out what a child is like by trying to find a context in which there would be no context. Trying to find the context of no context, or the view from nowhere. Just one more example. Pain under surgery without anesthetic is not the same as pain under torture. This is being scientifically proved. Oh, but I can't let this one go. No, there's two that I have to tell you about. H.G. Wells wrote a book called The One-Eyed Man is King. Not a book, a short story. H.G. Wells wrote a short story about the one-eyed man as king. You've all heard the expression, in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So that's chain index. The one-eyed man in the country of the sighted is not the same as the very same one-eyed man in the country of the blind. But H.G. Wells wanted to turn that around. So he wrote a short story about a one-eyed man who ends up in the country of the blind. And he thought he was going to end up as king because he heard this saying. And he could do all kinds of things with his vision that those people couldn't do because they were blind. But as it happens, they got along perfectly well without vision. They thought he was hallucinating or sick, and they didn't know what the hell he was talking about. He talked about the things that he could see. And then he fell in love with a blind girl who persuaded him to pull the piece of jelly out of his head so that he would be just like everybody else. A fascinating story. And an example of chain index and all sorts of other things. This one is fascinating to anyone who loves women. The woman in our world is not the same as a woman in the future world in which there are no men. I call it Planet of the Girls. What would happen in a world in which there were no men? I don't know. Here's the damn task. You can predict. Find 5 examples of the use or non-use of the chain index. It's easier to avoid triviality, I think, but still avoid triviality. So we find 5 examples of use and non-use, let's say 3 use and 2 non-use or something like that. Explain, why they are using the non-use and why they're choosing them. And that's the third devices task. This is a Korzybskian critique of Foucault. This is what I write here. I'll just read what I have here. We could conclude or climax the discussion of the devices with sex. Do you already see, hear, feel something? Is it indexed, chain indexed, dated, etc.? In 1933, before the end of Freud's career, and about the time as Michel Foucault was being born, in 1933, Korzybski wrote, page 17, Science and Sound, Freud in the year 1900 ascribed one undifferentiated sex, even to infants, which revolted public opinion. Korzybski says, Freud wrote about sex without an index, which revolted public opinion. If he had not used the fiction, sex, Korzybski says, sex is a fiction. If it doesn't have indexes, if it doesn't have dates, if it doesn't have quotes, it's a fiction. And if Freud had not used that fiction, he would not have got into such difficulties. If he had explained that an infant has a ticklish organ which could be labeled sex 0 at birth, sex 1 at 1 year old, sex 2 at the age of 2, etc., these are obviously different in life. But the differences are hidden by the one abstract definitional sex. The abstract label sex labels a fiction, as he says. Sex varies with every individual, not only with age, but in relation to endless other factors. So there he's throwing all the devices onto the concept, the highly abstract concept, sex. Well, Korzybski wrote this 50 years before Foucault's attempt to reformulate the term sex as This is Foucault's term, bodies and pleasures. Foucault is also attacking the use of the term sex. He says, let's think of it instead as bodies and pleasures. Remember the Trobrianders were told that they didn't think that orgasm was all that important in their sexual behavior. Okay, we should know, however, that Freud, in combat with Jung, especially Mrs. Jung, substituted the incredibly abstract term libido. Freud insisted on using the term sex. He was not aware of such he was not unaware of such objections. He insisted on using the term sex in his theory because he wanted to point to what all these forms of sex have in common, which he thought was very important. But he also insisted simultaneously on its pan-bodily nature. So both Korzybski and Foucault get Freud wrong, because Freud already knew that there was no such thing as sex. As a matter of fact, Freud, in the 3 essays on sexuality, 1905, puts forward the strongest argument yet that there is no such single thing as sex. But he insisted on maintaining the term sex. But he insists, as Korzybski was doing in that quote I just gave you, also on its polymorphous character. So he insists simultaneously on its polymorphous, what he calls polymorphous, perverse sexuality. Polymorphous means having many forms. But he still wants to use the word sex. He doesn't want to drop the term, which everyone is saying it should drop. So it's like sex, and in the index place, it's polymorphous. In other words, many forms. Index, date, chain index, quotes, hyphens, etc. They're all there in the word polymorphous. Because he believed that there were important continuities among the forms, which civilization would prefer to repress. So the general semantics devices added to the term sex as subscripts actually express something closer than Korzybski assumed to Freud's view. And I won't, there's more that I could say about that, but I think it's a very interesting way of concluding the discussion of the first 4 of the 5 or 6 devices. Here's a footnote to the footnote, and then I'm sure you know, don't forget to hand in your tasks. This is a book about art. The title of the book is Art. So already some kind of insanity is being, what is art? So what is sex? What is love? So this guy writes, the idea of the sexuality of plants provoked moralistic discussion in the 17th century. Plants are sexual, male, female, offspring. Maybe not pleasure, who knows, I've never been a dandelion. But the idea of the sexuality, at least to my knowledge, the idea of the sexuality of plants provoked moralistic discussion in the 17th century. It was a great shock that female plants were fertilized by more than one male plant. Okay, now you're laughing. But when the Intertemporal Commission on Sanity visits us from 300 years hence, what are they going to be laughing at us about? Is my question here. Hey, and the answer can only be we don't know. So let's be careful.